But we're going to be in Exodus chapter 2 today. Exodus chapter 2 as we continue on with our series through the book of Exodus here. As I'm making my way over there, whenever I was growing up, I heard somewhat frequently whenever I was playing soccer. I grew up playing soccer for a very long time in my life, and whenever I was growing up, I was actually pretty good at soccer, and so oftentimes I heard from my coaches that I had a lot of potential. I had a lot of potential here. My screen is freaking out there. But I heard that I had a lot of potential whenever I was playing soccer. Now, I also played basketball my whole life, and I never heard that I had a lot of potential in basketball, as you can probably tell just by looking at me, that I did not have that much potential here. But whenever I was playing soccer, I had, they always said that, and I knew it was a compliment. I knew that, like, what my coach was saying was that it was actually that I had, that one day if I worked really hard, that I could actually be a pretty good player and things like that. And I knew it was a compliment, but as a young man, I never quite took it that way. Because whenever I heard about that I had a lot of potential, what I internalized that as a young man was that one day I might be good, but I'm not very good yet, is how I usually thought about that. Coincidentally, I still actually hear, usually whenever the snowbirds come back into Florida in the springtime, usually one of them, every single year this has happened, they're like, "Joel, you got a lot of potential to be a great preacher someday." I'm like, "Thanks, Harold. I guess see you next year, buddy." And but whenever I hear that, I never really took it as a compliment, just because I knew that, yeah, one day I will be great if I really try hard, but I'm not that great yet. And so with that in mind, I just wanted to tell you all that you have a lot of potential. And that's not an insult, I promise, but rather, as Christians, it is something, rather, that is a good thing. Because as Christians, we always should be striving for what's next. We should never feel like we've arrived. We should never feel like we know all of the answers. The moment that happens is the moment you stop growing, and that moment is a moment that you're not going to be used anymore by God. Certainly, we've all probably met Christians who feel that way, that feel like they know everything, that they have, figured out every single argument that there is. And if you don't know anyone, just like go visit a first-year seminary class. Like you will find that those guys read a John Piper book last summer and they have figured out every single issue, and that if we just get on board, like that we know people like that feel like they know anything, but in that moment then they can't learn. And so we always want to be people that say, you know what, God is preparing me for what's next. I want to keep learning. I want to keep growing, no matter if I'm in the kids department or I'm 80, 90, 100 years old. There's still something to be done here for God. And so we're going to be in Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 1 here. And all of my electronic devices are freaking out on me, sound booth. So Yoakum, if you would just be so kind, and we'll stay at verse 2. There we go. Or verse 1, excuse me. All right, so Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 1 here. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. This is going to bother me. See, this is why technology is for the young. All right, so there we go. All right, so now a man went from the house of Levi and took his wife, a Levite woman. Now, to start out with, this is huge. I can tell you're all very impressed by how huge this is. That he's from what house is he from right now? House of Levi, all right? Now, for those of you that know your Bible very well, what tribe was the Levite tribe? What did they do? They were the priests of God, right? And so it starts out, and it's talking about Moses right now. We're going to see that in just a minute here. But we're talking about Moses, and it starts out by saying that he is from the tribe of Levi, which was huge. It was significant. And you're not going to fully realize it, but like in 6 months from now, I'm going to say, hey, remember that one time that I said this was a big deal and that you should pay attention. And in 6 months from now, you're going to be like, I wasn't paying attention. I have no idea what you're talking about. But just know I told you so, and I'm I'm going to pull up the YouTube clip in 6 months from now to say that I made this point. But rather, why this isn't so important is because we're going to see now that this means that Moses had a special connection. He was part of this tribe that connected the people of God all the way back up to heaven himself. And he was the one that brought offerings to God. He was the one that got the word from God and disseminated among the people. And so this is huge. This is so big that he is from the tribe of Levi there. But it goes on in verse 2. It says, then when the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. Now, I love this because it says here that he was a fine child. When the woman conceived and bore a son, she had a fine child, which means that he was a good-looking little baby. Why I love this is, does anybody know who wrote the book of Exodus? Moses. He just called himself a good-looking baby right now. And listen, I know everything, all the words in the Bible are inspired. There's no mistakes. He didn't add in. But if God told me to pin my life story to put in the Bible, I totally would have been like, Joel Hastings was born. He was the best looking kid around, all right? And that's essentially what he does here, that he was a fine child. He was a good looking little boy. We're going to see why that matters in just a little bit here. But she hid him then for 3 months. For 3 months, she hid him. But just for a second and pause here. Because why did she hide him? Do you remember why she was hiding him here? Because Pharaoh had already commanded not only the Hebrew midwives, but every single Egyptian. The entire nation was under a command that said, if you see a Hebrew little boy, you're supposed to take him and pick him up and throw him into the Nile. And so for the next 3 months, she's living and trying to hide a little baby. And if I was in that situation, honestly, what I would probably be thinking of is your wife gets pregnant and you're both excited and you're just thrilled about what God has for you. But if you knew that this was a command, that every single little boy was going to be killed, wouldn't you just be praying for a little girl? That you want to say no, I don't want to have to go through that. I don't want him to have this death warrant on his life. Please let it just be a little girl, And that time you couldn't tell. There's no sonograms, there's no nothing. So for 9 months, you're just probably praying and hoping it's a little girl. And then that day comes and the little boy is born and you're so excited. You're filled with love. At the same time, you're filled with terror. Because in that time, and think about it, houses weren't like they are today. If you were a slave back then in Egypt at that point, there was probably just a small 1 or 2 room house, and then the windows were just holes in the wall. And the door might have had a slat over it, but it's mainly just a hole in the wall. How do you keep a baby quiet for 3 months, knowing that if the wrong person walks by whenever that baby is crying, you're dead, the baby's dead. They could walk in, grab that baby, and throw it in the Nile. That's nerve-wracking. That fills you with anxiety like that we probably have never fully experienced, any one of us. Listen, I get filled with anxiety even just walking on an airplane with a baby. like just walking in and everybody just gives you that look and I'm just like, I'm sorry. I'll do, and I break every single rule. I will shove all the candy in the world down the kids. Just be quiet. All the screen time for 4 hours. I don't care. Just be quiet. But it is impossible. It is impossible just to keep those children quiet for multiple hours on end, and yet they were trying to do it for 3 months at a time. That would be filled with anxiety, filled with heartache, filled with just so much worry here. And so in verse 3, though, it says, when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and dabbed it with bitumen and placed it among the reeds by the river. So it says, whenever she could not hide him any longer. So she took a little basket. She put it in the river. But what's interesting, if you were reading this in the Hebrew, which I'm sure you all, read Hebrew. If you were reading it in the Hebrew right now, you would notice something a little bit different about this verse. That word basket isn't the normal word for basket. In fact, it was not a very common word at all. It was used 26 times in the Old Testament, 2 times in this chapter. Every other time that word basket was used, it was used in between Genesis chapter 6 and Genesis chapter 8. Anybody remember what Genesis 6 to 8 is talking about? The ark. Meaning that little basket isn't the word basket, it's actually the word ark. And so if you were reading this in the Hebrew, you would be reading it, when she couldn't hide him any longer, she took and she put him in a little ark and pushed him out in the water. And that is done on purpose because he wants you to think, he wants you to know that just like Noah got in the ark, went out into the water, and it wasn't that they were scared or trying to save their life, but God had a little plan on their life that said, I'm going to save all humanity through this ark. In the same way, Moses, this little baby Moses, got put into a little tiny little ark here. He got put inside of it, pushed out, and said, I'm going to save my people through this little ark. And it goes to show us just a little bit of a taste of what that mother was feeling in that moment. See, for us, we would probably be filled with fear, wouldn't we? If we had a little baby that knew that we could die and at any point somebody could come in, just snatch him out of our arms and throw him into the Nile, we would be just filled with fear and filled with worry, so many of us, but not his mom and dad. Rather, they were operating that God was going to do something wonderful here. God was going to do something great here. And the first point in your bulletin is that let your motivation be faith, not fear. Let your motivation be faith, not fear. Now, you might be saying, okay, Joel, you say that she wasn't motivated by faith or fear, but rather faith. But like, where are you getting that from? I'll tell you where I'm getting that from. Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. If you want to flip there, you can. I'm going to go ahead and start reading it quickly, though. It says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. By faith, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents. They didn't hide him out of fear. In fact, the next line says, because they saw the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Because they saw the child was a good-looking kid, they weren't afraid of the king's edict. That nothing that they did that day was out of fear. Rather, they knew that God was going to do something with this little child. And so they had enough faith to put him in a little basket, push him out into a river, and say, God is going to do something. I'm just going to trust for the miracle. They were motivated not out of fear, but out of faith. So much different than how we would normally go. And in the next verse here, verse 4, it says, and the sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. 5. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her servant woman, and she took it. Verse 6, when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrew children. We'll stop right there. So the mother went down, put Moses in the little ark, put Moses in a little basket that was covered with pitch, and just kind of pushed him out among the reeds and a little bit hidden, just trusting that God would take care of him. And then she left. That mama left her little baby right there, which you can't even imagine being that way. But Miriam, his older sister, was probably 8 to 12, stayed there and just was watching what's going to happen to this little baby. And then it says that Pharaoh's daughter came down. Now, it's interesting. Number one, the reason why she was even bathing in the Nile. See, as Pharaoh's daughter, she probably would have been growing up in the palace or one of the palaces there. And in that time period, even back then, if you were extremely wealthy, you'd probably have a bath inside of your home. Your servants would go pick up water. They would, boil it, make it hot, and put it in the water. And so you could take a warm bath. But then this Pharaoh's daughter, important person, was going down to the Nile to actually bathe. And we say, why in the world was she going down to the dirty river when they could have boiled the water and brought it back up there? But if you were to go over to India, and maybe you've seen some of the videos, oftentimes the people in India will go out and they'll bathe in the rivers. And not to necessarily get themselves clean, because some of those rivers are just nasty if you've seen those videos, but rather they go out to the river because it's ceremonial clean. They go out to the river because they see the river as being from the gods or even a god itself, and so they'll go down and they feel spiritually cleansing. It's a spiritual act of worship whenever the Hindus will go down and bathe in certain spiritual waters. And in the same way, the Egyptians thought of the Nile that way, thought of it being as from God itself, really part part of the God ecosystem themselves. And so whenever this woman was going down to bathe, it wasn't that she was just trying to get the dirt off of her, but this was her worshiping her Egyptian gods, going down and ceremonially cleansing herself down in the water, which helps us understand what she did next, because she went down. This young woman went down, started ceremonially cleansing herself, bathing herself, cleansing herself from the Egyptian gods, and she looks over there, and there's a basket. In her mind, certainly she probably is thinking, that's probably a gift from the gods. Right there. And so she then goes over, she calls one of her young ladies, hey, go get me that basket. And so they bring the basket over there, and she opens it up, and it's a little boy. And I think this is the reason why it's actually important that he was a good-looking baby, all right? Because let's face it, not all babies are good-looking. I'm not going to say that in baby dedication Sunday or something like that. I'll, lose my job. Like, ooh, dedicate this one extra. But let's be honest, it probably helped that he was a good-looking little boy. All right, because if you open up that basket, it's an ugly baby. You closing that basket up. No. So she opens up the basket, and she sees a fine, beautiful little boy, and he's crying. He's doing what babies do best. They're looking just cute right there. And this young Pharaoh's daughter sees that, and her heart just goes out to this child. And she says, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Now, we don't know how she knew that, because babies, they were all Middle Eastern. They all kind of looked the same. But like maybe it's the way that he was dressed, maybe circumcision, maybe it was just two and two put together. This baby in the basket had to be a Hebrew child there. We don't know, but she knew instantly that he was a Hebrew boy, which put her in a difficult situation, because her daddy just told all the Egyptians in the entire country, if you find a Hebrew little boy, you take him and you throw him in the Nile and you kill him. Now she's standing in the Nile holding a little baby. What is she going to do? But God had a bigger plan. That God had a better plan than anything that we could have imagined, anything that we could have thought up here. And so we continue to see here in verse 7, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women, to nurse the child for you? Verse 8. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Verse 9. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So that the woman took the child and nursed him. I love the Bible. This is awesome. This is awesome. If you didn't catch this, what happened? All right, so Moses' mom and dad knew that they couldn't care for him, knew that he was going to die if he stayed inside that house, but they didn't operate out of fear, did they? They operated out of faith that God was going to save this little baby. So they put him inside of a little ark and pushed him out into the river and said, all right, God, you got this. And then that same Pharaoh that commanded this little boy to die with all the other little boys was going to be the same Pharaoh that ended up paying for the wages of the mother to take care of her own baby. Like, in this whole story, Pharaoh's the bad guy. Pharaoh's the Antichrist. Pharaoh's the one that's going against God. And God says, oh, you're going to try to kill my people? How about you pay for the one that's going to deliver them? This is how God operates. You couldn't write this story. They couldn't have come up with this plan any way at all, but rather, so she got to nurse her own baby for the first 3 years at least and be paid to do it. And nobody could touch little Moses because he was Pharaoh's godson. He was Pharaoh's grandson. That's how God operates. God's plan is so much better. And that's the next point in your bulletin, is that God's plan is better than your plan. God's plan is better than your plan. And listen, if you write really good notes, you'll notice that this point has been a point in like 14 different sermons of mine. But I find that we need to be reminded, because we know that God's plan is better than our plan right up until we get that call from the doctor's office, don't we? And then we say, God, what are you doing? Right up until we get called into our boss's office and don't have a job anymore. Right up until everything, right up until COVID happened, right up until all these things completely fell apart. Then now I need to remind you once again, no matter what you are going through, that God's plan is better than your plan. It might look completely different, but in this same way, that this was not how they would have planned for it, now they're getting paid to take care of their own son. God's plan is better. And so in the next verse here, verse 10, it says, when the child grew older, She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, I drew him out of the water. So about 3 years old is when they were weaned, and at some point around then, she brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And Moses, it's not actually, doesn't mean to be drawn out of the water, but it kind of sounds like it, so that's where his name came from. And now, don't misunderstand. He was not in line to become Pharaoh one day. He was not one of the, Prince William or Edward, or I don't remember who all they are, but there's like the royal family that actually means something. We watch their weddings, once every 20 years. But then there's also like about 1,000 other royals. Moses would have been one of those, like the Earl of Sandwich guy or whatever they are. Like he would have been one of those. But still, at the same time, he would have grown up in the palace, would have grown up with servants, would have grown up with everything possibly given to him. This was God's plan, that he be trained up under some of the best teachers and be connected to some of the most powerful people in the entire world. But now in verse 11, it skips ahead because it says one day when Moses had grown up, Acts chapter 7 says it was about when he was 40 years old. So the first 40 years of his life, he has grown up as an Egyptian prince, having the whole world given to him. This is all he knows. But then in verse 11, it says he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Notice it says his people twice, talking about the Hebrews. So Moses, even though he was growing up in the Egyptian palace, he knew that all these people around him, all these servants were actually his people. And that is doing something inside of his heart. And he had to be with them. He had a longing to be with them. So he went out and he was just looking at the burdens, looking at seeing what they were going through. Probably his heart breaking, not understanding, why am I in the palace and all my people are out here struggling. And that's when he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. If he was an Egyptian soldier, he probably wouldn't have even been punished if he killed a man. You could kill, if you were a soldier, you could kill one of the slaves and not face anything. If you weren't a soldier, you'd probably just have to pay a small fine to Pharaoh because you killed one of his slaves. So it wasn't a particularly unusual thing. Maybe for Moses, maybe he had been sheltered for that long, but it wasn't particularly unusual. But at that moment, he then stepped in and he did something that would change his life. Verse 12, he looked this way and that way, and seeing no one, he struck down an Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, first off, I would say, just to clarify, if you see somebody and they are being abused, if there's somebody that's attacking another person, I think not only is it okay to, you should step in and try to help them and try to save them. That's a good and honorable thing to do. I kind of doubt, though, if this was the right thing for Moses to do in that moment. God had a plan, but generally speaking, if you're going to go do something and you look this way and you look that way, meaning you're going to look to make sure nobody sees you, then it's probably not the right thing to do in that moment, right? I don't ever look this way and that way right before I eat a salad, because I want people to know I eat salad and feel good about myself. Like if I eat 42 Oreos, then I'm going to look this way and that way and be like, I don't want anybody to see this, right? Because whenever you do something and you're looking around, then it's probably an indication that you're not doing what you ought to be doing. Same way, some of you are deleting your internet history, hiding it, and you're looking this way and that way, making sure nobody sees you. You're deleting some text messages from your spouse because you're hiding things. If you have already gone that step and you're looking around to see who can see you, then you have already entered into that sin world. And so he looks this way and looks that way. And we know from later on, we're going to see here, that Moses has a little bit of a temper. Because if he was the prince of Egypt, couldn't he have just stepped in and said, hey man, I'm the prince, stop it. You're going too far, step back. He had the authority, I'm sure, to do that. But yet he saw something, he snapped, and then he went and he struck that Egyptian down, meaning that he killed him, and then he hit him in the sand. And second of all, if you hide a body, you're probably in the wrong. That's a free point, not in your bulletin there. But if you get to that point where you're digging a hole out in the wilderness, you probably have already, crossed some lines here. So I kind of think that Moses probably snapped and not operated the way that he should have. In the next verse, though, it says, when he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? Verse 14, he answered, who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, this thing is surely known. So he goes out the next day, kind of returns to the scene of the crime a little bit. But this time now he doesn't see an Egyptian and a Hebrew. He sees two Hebrews fighting. He's like, come on, guys, we're brothers. Why are you fighting? That's the same thing I do with my little boys. As they're fighting, like, come on, you're brothers. Why are you sitting on each other? Like, what is going on here? And the one responds back. The one who was in the wrong says, who made you judge over us? Ironically, if he was going to wait a few decades, God made him a judge over it. Like, God actually rose him up and put him in this very position here. But right now he says, who made you judge over me? You going to kill me like you did that Egyptian? And then Moses, it says, was afraid because he thought this thing is going to be known. And guess what? It was known. In verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So now Pharaoh hears it. And we say, isn't that a little bit extreme? Weren't they like distant cousins or something like that? Yes, they probably were. Maybe they knew each other and things like that. But if, in Pharaoh's mind, he's trying to oppress and keep the Hebrew people under slavery. There's this one random cousin, Moses, who just so happens to be a Hebrew and also an Egyptian. But you say, where did this guy come from? And then now he goes out and he kills one of the Egyptian guards. You're probably thinking, oh no, Moses is going to try to start a revolt with his people. I better kill him right now before he can do that. And so he comes out and he tries to kill Moses. Moses then goes and flees to the land of Midian. And Midian would have been like Saudi Arabia area, would have been completely across the Red Sea and keep going on there and in the wilderness. And he sat down by a well. And it happened to probably think that if you were Moses now, you spend the first 40 years of your life as an Egyptian prince with everything that you could possibly want, with literally growing in the best house in all of the world. You were one of the princes there. You had everything that you could ever want. And then in one moment, he lost his temper. He killed a man. And now his whole entire life has changed. And he's probably looking around thinking, what have I done? Some of us have been there too, where we felt like everything was fine, and then we made a decision. Maybe it was sin, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was just a bad decision, but yet we then look around and say, man, my whole life has fallen apart. I'm sitting out in a wilderness by myself. And the next point in your bulletin, though, is this. As life falls apart, God's plan will take shape. As life falls apart, God's plan will take shape. See, because not only was Moses going to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt, but God first had to get Egypt out of Moses too. And he had to draw him out. And in the same way with Moses, there have been so many times in my life, I'm really good at making plans and building things up and saying, this is the way my life is going to go. And God looks at me and says, that's cute. None of that matters, right? He just knocks it down and says, I'm going to build it up the way that I want to build it up. And that's what he did for Moses as well. And so we see this in the next verse here, verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. Pray for that man. Where the Huff's at? Dan isn't here. Just his daughters are over here. So the Huff family. No, just kidding. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs of water to water their father's flock. So there's 7 of them. They come, they're trying to feed their father's flock here. Verse 17, the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. Verse 18, when they had come home to their father, Reuel, who was Jethro, he said, how is it that you have come so soon, home so soon? Verse 19, and they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock. So I'll stop right there here. So he's sitting down. The 7 daughters come by, and they're trying to feed their flock. And then shepherds come. And typically, we think of highly of shepherds because, Psalms 23 and things. But typically in that day, like, shepherds were pretty much no good people. They were kind of gypsies that just roamed around. They were typically not that great of men there. And so they saw these young girls, and they just push them aside and try to harass them and do all these things. And so then Moses steps up, and he puts a stop to that, fights them back. And then not only with that, he then goes up and he fills the water troughs and he waters all the sheep for these young girls. And so they go home, and then the father immediately knows something up because they got home too quickly. It's like when you send your kid to go clean their room and they come back in 2 minutes, you're like, nope, something happened. Like it wasn't what I asked you to do, something happened. And so he says, like, how did you get home so quickly today? What'd you do? Did you even water the sheep and do all that? And he's like, well, no, an Egyptian delivered us out of hand. This would have been weird because they were hundreds of miles away from Egypt. So there's just this random Egyptian man that helped protect them, that fed their flock. And so the father then, in that moment, he did what a good father would do. And he said, where is he? Verse 20, then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. Essentially what's happening in verse 21, you'll see Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. He's like, I got 7 daughters. I got to marry one of you off. Get that man right now. Bring him back. We're going to have a wedding today. It's essentially what's happening here. But he comes in here. Moses comes back, and he stays there from ages 40 all the way to age 80. The first, I love it. What? First 80 years of his life was simply preparing him for what's coming next. See, because if you were Moses, once again, and you were just walking around in that wilderness, at this point, you're just taking care of your father-in-law's sheep. You're just walking around in the wilderness, probably wondering, like, man, I had it all. I was the prince of Egypt. I had everything going for me now. And now, like, sure, it's a great family. I'm happy to be here and all of this. But now I'm just walking around in the wilderness, leading a bunch of sheep behind me, just learning how to survive for 40 years without realizing that God took him out of Egypt, put him in the wilderness for 40 straight years with a bunch of sheep in order that he could go back into Egypt, get a flock of human sheep, and lead them out into the wilderness for 40 straight years. God was preparing him, even in that moment, even in that season, as he was just chasing after dumb sheep all day. It was just preparing him for what God was going to have next for him. Verse 22, she gave him a son, and he called his name Gershom. And he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. The last point is this, that God doesn't waste a season. He is preparing you even now. That God doesn't waste a season. He is preparing you even now. I don't care if you're 10 years old. I don't care if you're 80 years old. That if you are not dead, God's not done with you yet. He has something he is preparing for. Even right now, even in the season that you are in, however hard it may be, however difficult the things that you're going through, he is doing something. He's preparing you for something. In my own heart, in my own life, there's a few years ago before I got here, I always knew that I wanted to be a pastor from a little boy. Just what I wanted to do. And I started a church. I was one of the associate pastors there, and it was going well, but very quickly on, we just didn't have enough money to pay my salary as well. And so I had to go get a second job and work outside of the church. And it was a good job. They took good care of me, and there's nice people there, and I did my best to glorify God. But let me tell you, I hated it. I hated having to get up. I hated having to go into work. I hated having to spend 40 plus hours of my week doing stuff that I could care less about. Like I didn't care at all about it. I tried my best. I tried to glorify God. But in reality, the whole entire time I was like, God, I know you've called me to be a pastor. Why am I just sitting here, just wasting away for years on end, not doing what you have called me to do? And it wasn't until year after year that I started to realize God could put me in the spots that he wanted me to be in. That wasn't hard for him to get me to Brooksville. He just opened a door. He could do that whenever he wanted to. But in reality, what he was doing is he was preparing my heart for what I needed to go through in the years ahead. Oftentimes, the struggles that we face right now are just preparing our hearts to draw closer to God. And if your struggles draw you closer to God, then it's worth whatever you had to go through to get to it. It's worth it. It might not feel like it in the moment. When you're walking around in the wilderness, it might not feel like you're ever going to get there, but it's worth it. Let me finish off with one extra illustration. I didn't have time to do it in the first service, so if you want shorter sermons, go to the first service. I don't got anywhere to go. But RJ, can you come up here? Can I borrow you for a second, brother? I should have warned you we were talking before the service, but oftentimes in my life, it often feels like, yeah, I know God is preparing me for something. How come I never actually get to reach it? Do you ever feel like that? That, yeah, it's like my whole entire life, I've often been striving for, I've often been searching after, I've often been growing, but I feel like the moment that I take a step forward and I grow, like I'm still not there. I can never actually reach what God has for me. So I'm going to say, RJ's a good-looking man. I'm going to say RJ is the picture of who I want to become. He's the image that says, you know what, whenever I take a step forward, then I'm going to finally be at that moment. I'm going to finally be where God wants me to be. And so, RJ, if you're facing this way here, he's facing that way. And finally, I'd say, man, God has a purpose for me. God has a calling for me. And so finally, I take a step forward. And it's like, man, I'm finally going to get here. I'm finally going to happen. But you know what seems to happen? He takes a step forward too. And I say, I grew. I grew up. I became more spiritually mature. I'm in a better place than what I once was a year or two ago. So then I take another step and I say, I'm still growing in my relationship with Christ. I'm still growing. I'm getting closer. But then he continues to take a step forward. And 2 Corinthians chapter 3 says that we are going to go from glory to glory until we become into the image of the Son, until we behold him. And so our whole entire life is this, that God has a purpose for you, and he wants you to keep chasing after it. He wants you to keep stepping. But the moment that you step, he's going to say, and now I've got another thing for you to grow in. Now I got another way for you to raise up in. Now I got another way for you to glorify me in. And you're going to continue to chase after, all the way up until you finally get to heaven and you become in the image of the Son and you behold the glory. And that's our Christian walk. You can have a seat, brother. And that is what our faith looks like. Because so many of us, we feel like, when am I ever going to reach what God has for me? When am I ever going to overcome this? I overcame one addiction just to find another addiction. I overcame one heartache just to have another heartache. I overcame so much. I'm reading my Bible now. I'm doing better now. But then I make a step forward and I still feel like I'm not there just quite yet, because God says, I got more in store for you yet. If you're not dead, then God isn't done with you. And we get to keep growing, and we keep growing, and keep growing, because even when we're in the wilderness for 40 years, God says, you don't even know. If I told you what's next, you would run away, which is what we're going to see next week. With every head bowed, with every eye closed. Number one, if you're here today and never put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, I invite you to do that. All of this would be a mystery to you without that saving faith. And so I say, you come and find me after the service. If you want to know more about how Jesus died for you, you can have a relationship with him. But certainly, for the most part, this service was for the believer, for the Christian in here today. Maybe some of you have felt like you've been in a wilderness for a long time. You've been wandering around for a long time. And maybe it's actually that God has just been preparing you for a long time for what's next. And even though the plan that he had is completely different than our plan, it's completely better as well. And we can hope in that and we can trust in that. I invite you to pray out to him even in your heart right now and say, God, I don't know what you're doing right now, but I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust that you're preparing for me something better than what I could have prepared myself. Father, Lord, I pray that we would be a people that learn to trust you more. That even when all of it seems to break, even when we're like Moses and our whole world has gotten turned upside down and we don't know what's coming next, Lord, I pray that we would learn to trust you like never before, knowing that you are preparing for something better. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.